History often remembers the Spanish-American War as the moment the United States stepped onto the global stage as a rising empire. Yet hidden behind the headlines of victory and liberation was another war, one far more brutal and less remembered, fought not in Cuba or Puerto Rico but across the islands of the Philippines. This was a conflict where promises of freedom were betrayed, where villages burned, and where a young empire tested its claws in the blood of another people's struggle. The Philippine-American War, and the battles within it, became the crucible in which America's global identity was forged. It was not just a fight over territory. It was a test of ideals, of imperial ambition, and of human endurance. The hidden battles of Samar, Luzon, and Balangiga shaped the path of the 20th century, even if textbooks tried to erase them. Today, we uncover those forgotten fields of fire, where America became an empire at the expense of Filipino freedom. In 1898, the Filipino people rose with renewed hope as the Spanish colonial grip weakened under the pressure of both revolutionaries and foreign powers. Filipino fighters under Emilio Aguinaldo believed their long struggle against Spanish tyranny was finally nearing its end. When the United States intervened in the Spanish-American War, it seemed like salvation had arrived from across the Pacific. The American Navy, under Commodore Dewey, destroyed the Spanish fleet at Manila Bay, an event that thrilled Filipino revolutionaries. For many, this was the moment independence was finally within reach. The Filipino revolutionaries welcomed the Americans with open arms, offering support and assistance in expelling the Spanish from their last strongholds. Aguinaldo envisioned a partnership that would result in full independence, as the Americans had presented themselves as liberators. A provisional Philippine government was formed, eager to step into the light of nationhood after centuries of colonial rule. But while Filipino leaders raised their flag in celebration, American officials quietly raised questions about control, strategy, and opportunity. To them, the Philippines was more than just an ally's homeland. It was a strategic gateway to Asia. In Washington, the debate raged between those who saw America as a republic of liberty and those who dreamed of a global empire. Newspapers praised the acquisition of territories as trophies of victory, while business leaders eyed the Philippines as a gateway to lucrative trade with China. President McKinley spoke of a divine duty to civilize and uplift the Filipino people, echoing the language of imperial justification. Meanwhile, the voices of Filipinos demanding self-rule were drowned out in the corridors of American power. As Spanish authority crumbled, Aguinaldo declared Philippine independence on June 12, 1898. It was a moment of triumph that electrified the islands, marked by the raising of the Philippine flag and the playing of the national anthem. Yet while Filipinos celebrated, the United States refused to recognize the declaration. Instead, in secret negotiations with Spain, America purchased the Philippines for $20 million under the Treaty of Paris. The betrayal was not sudden. It unfolded slowly, like a shadow creeping across the battlefield. American troops, once allies in the fight against Spain, began restricting Filipino fighters from entering Manila after Spanish surrender. Tensions rose as the Philippine army was pushed aside, denied participation in the victory they had fought for. In the minds of Filipino leaders, this exclusion revealed the truth. America was not preparing to hand over independence. By late 1898, anger burned in the camps of Filipino fighters, but leaders still hoped negotiation might secure recognition. Aguinaldo sought dialogue with American officials, attempting to convince them of the Philippines' right to sovereignty. But Washington had already decided. The islands were too valuable to let go. In the back rooms of diplomacy, the future of millions of Filipinos was bought and sold like property. What had begun as an alliance ended as occupation. The breaking point came on the night of February 4, 1899, near Manila. A single shot, fired at a Filipino patrol by an American sentry, ignited the flames of open conflict. Within hours, full-scale fighting erupted between American and Filipino forces, marking the official start of the Philippine-American War. What might have been contained as a border skirmish spiraled into a nationwide struggle. The U.S. military, far larger and better equipped, quickly pushed Filipino forces back, capturing towns and villages with ruthless efficiency. Yet every advance only hardened Filipino resistance. The war was not just fought on open fields, but also in dense jungles, rice paddies, and narrow village streets. Filipino fighters adopted guerrilla tactics, using their knowledge of the terrain to ambush and harass American troops. For the U.S. soldiers, this was not the clean war they had imagined. It was a confusing, grinding conflict against an enemy that refused to disappear. Skirmishes bled into massacres, and the line between soldier and civilian blurred in the chaos. Both sides suffered, but the toll on Filipino civilians was catastrophic. The U.S. military's response grew harsher as frustration mounted. Villages suspected of aiding guerrillas were burned, crops destroyed, and entire communities displaced. Reports of atrocities spread, from the use of torture methods like the water cure to the execution of prisoners. While some American officers protested the brutality, others embraced it as the only way to break resistance. On September 28, 1901, in the town of Balangiga on Samar Island, a shocking event unfolded that would etch its name into history. Filipino fighters, disguised as laborers and townspeople, suddenly attacked a U.S. Army garrison during breakfast. With bolos, spears, and captured rifles, they overwhelmed the unsuspecting Americans in a rare and stunning victory for the resistance. Dozens of U.S. soldiers were killed, marking one of the bloodiest defeats for the American Army during the war. For Filipinos, Balangiga was a symbol of courage, defiance, and hope. For the U.S., it was humiliation that demanded retribution. The Balangiga attack shocked the American public and military alike, sparking outrage and calls for vengeance. Newspapers painted it as a massacre, while Filipinos saw it as a desperate act of resistance against overwhelming occupation. The incident exposed the intensity of Filipino determination and their willingness to fight even when outgunned. In response, General Jacob Smith issued orders that would forever stain America's record in the Philippines. Infamously telling his troops to turn Samar into a howling wilderness, Smith directed that anyone over the age of 10 suspected of rebellion should be killed. Villages were burned, civilians slaughtered, and terror spread through the countryside. What followed was not just retaliation, it was a campaign of extermination that revealed the darkest face of empire. Despite suffering brutal crackdowns, the Filipino resistance did not vanish. Instead, it adapted, turning to guerrilla warfare with remarkable resilience. Fighters melted into the countryside, blending with civilians, striking quickly and retreating before American forces could retaliate. The Americans struggled to fight an invisible enemy. Soldiers found themselves marching through jungles and swamps where disease killed more men than bullets. Fear haunted every patrol as the line between friend and foe was blurred by the guerrilla tactics of the revolutionaries. Filipino leaders like General Antonio Luna had laid the foundation for disciplined guerrilla strategy before his assassination, and others carried the torch of his vision. Even without centralized command, local resistance groups carried on the fight with determination. The U.S. Army, desperate to crush resistance, turned to brutal methods that blurred the line between military action and war crimes. One of the most notorious tactics was the water cure, a form of torture where prisoners were forced to ingest gallons of water until near suffocation. Atrocities were not isolated incidents. They became patterns of conduct in certain provinces. Entire villages were relocated into concentration camps known as zones of protection, where disease and starvation claimed countless lives. Crops were destroyed to deny guerrillas food, leaving civilians to suffer hunger. Reports of these abuses eventually reached the United States, sparking debate in Congress and the press. Anti-imperialist voices condemned the war as a betrayal of American ideals, pointing to the atrocities as evidence of corruption and cruelty. Yet defenders of empire dismissed the accounts as exaggerations, insisting that the Philippines had to be subdued for its own good. Hidden within the jungles and hills of the Philippines were massacres rarely recorded in official history. In villages suspected of aiding rebels, American troops sometimes executed men en masse, leaving women and children to flee in terror. The worst of these massacres occurred far from the eyes of international observers. Civilians trapped in reconcentration zones died by the thousands from disease and malnutrition. Entire towns were reduced to ashes, their populations scattered. For the Filipino people, these massacres were seared into memory, passed down through generations as stories of survival and loss. Even within the U.S. Army, whispers of unease spread. Some officers filed reports condemning the slaughter, while others chose silence to preserve their careers. War crimes trials were rare, and punishments often light when they occurred at all. The massacres remained largely unacknowledged in American memory, hidden beneath layers of patriotic myth. Back home in America, the war in the Philippines was framed through carefully managed propaganda. Newspapers that once rallied for Cuban independence now echoed government justifications for annexation. Stories of American heroism were highlighted, while accounts of atrocities were downplayed or dismissed. The Filipino resistance was portrayed as savagery, and their leaders branded as rebels rather than patriots. The press was not entirely silent. Anti-imperialist publications like The Nation and activists like Mark Twain spoke against the war. Twain, in particular, denounced America's actions as hypocrisy, writing with biting satire about the bloodshed committed in the name of civilization. But their voices were drowned out by the mainstream press, which echoed the government line. For many Americans, the Philippines faded into a distant, half-forgotten war, overshadowed by domestic prosperity. This manipulation of memory ensured that the Philippine-American War never occupied the same place in U.S. history as the Revolutionary or Civil War. It became a hidden chapter, tucked away to preserve the narrative of America as a liberator rather than a conqueror. The human cost of the war was staggering, though estimates vary. Hundreds of thousands of Filipinos died from combat, starvation, disease, and displacement. The civilian population bore the brunt of the suffering, caught between guerrilla fighters and American crackdowns. Families were torn apart, livelihoods destroyed, and entire communities uprooted. For the U.S., thousands of soldiers perished, many not from battle, but from tropical diseases like malaria and dysentery. Behind the numbers were individual stories of tragedy and resilience. Mothers carrying starving children through jungles, farmers watching their rice fields burn, and young soldiers writing letters home that never reached their families. The suffering was immense, yet it was endured with dignity by many Filipinos who clung to their vision of freedom. In America, casualty reports trickled in but rarely sparked outrage. The loss of soldiers was framed as sacrifice for a noble cause, while Filipino deaths were often dismissed as collateral damage. This imbalance in valuing human life reflected the imperial mindset that underpinned the conflict. The true cost of empire was measured in Filipino blood, a price rarely acknowledged in the annals of U.S. history. The Philippine-American War became a training ground for the U.S. military in ways both practical and philosophical. Tactics of counterinsurgency, pacification, and psychological warfare that emerged during the conflict would echo in later wars, from Vietnam to Iraq. New technologies and strategies were tested, including the use of telegraphs for rapid communication, railways for troop movement, and intelligence gathering through local informants. These innovations reflected America's adaptation to a new kind of warfare. But alongside progress came darker legacies, the normalization of torture, scorched earth policies, and collective punishment as tools of control. This transformation was not only military but also ideological. The belief that America had a mission to spread its values, even at gunpoint, took root. Leaders spoke of uplifting and civilizing, but the reality was domination and subjugation. The Philippine-American War thus marked the point where America's military embraced empire as its purpose, a shift that would define the 20th century. For the Filipino people, the war ended not with freedom, but with colonization. By 1902, Aguinaldo had been captured and organized resistance largely suppressed. The U.S. declared victory, but true peace never returned. The promise of liberation turned into a prolonged occupation. American officials presented themselves as benevolent rulers, promoting education and governance reforms. Yet the underlying reality was clear. The Philippines was no longer fighting for independence, but living under empire. Filipino voices in governance were limited, and decisions ultimately flowed from Washington. This era of deferred independence planted seeds of both progress and resentment. While some Filipinos benefited from education and new opportunities, many saw these as tools of assimilation rather than empowerment. The independence declared in 1898 was stolen, but its spirit endured in the hearts of the people. The conquest of the Philippines marked America's entry into Asia as a major power. With Guam and Hawaii already under its control, the Philippines became the stepping stone to the Pacific and the gateway to China. U.S. naval bases established in the islands gave the country strategic reach that extended across the ocean. This expansion reflected a shift in America's role on the global stage. No longer content with continental dominance, the United States now stood shoulder to shoulder with European empires. The Philippines gave access to markets, resources, and strategic positioning in the great game of imperial competition. The decision to hold the islands was not merely about territory, it was about power and prestige. For Filipinos, this meant their homeland was caught in a larger contest of empires. Their struggle for independence was overshadowed by America's ambitions against rivals like Japan and Britain. The islands became both a prize and a pawn, shaping geopolitics far beyond their shores. Decades later, the lessons of the Philippine-American War resurfaced in the jungles of Vietnam. Once again, American forces found themselves fighting a determined guerrilla movement on foreign soil. The strategies tested in the Philippines, search and destroy missions, relocation of villages, psychological warfare, were repeated in Southeast Asia. Just as in the Philippines, the U.S. underestimated the resolve of local fighters and the power of nationalist movements. Superior firepower could win battles, but it could not win hearts. The same cycle of brutality, resistance, and disillusionment played out across another generation. Vietnam became another war America struggled to explain, another chapter where ideals clashed with reality. Historians later looked back and saw the Philippines as the template for these later conflicts. The hidden war had not been forgotten by military strategists, even if it was buried in public memory. Its lessons were carried forward, often to disastrous effect. The legacy of the Philippine-American War continues to shape U.S.-Philippine relations even today. Military bases established during the occupation remained central through World War II and the Cold War. Cultural ties also emerged, English became widely spoken, and American influence spread through education, politics, and media. Yet alongside these changes was a lingering sense of unfinished business. Independence eventually came in 1946, but only after decades of colonial rule and another devastating occupation by Japan during World War II. The war's legacy is also evident in the way America views its role in the world. The justification of empire as benevolence, the belief in spreading freedom through force, and the tendency to erase uncomfortable truths all trace back to the Philippines. The Philippine-American War remains a ghost in history, haunting both nations with unanswered questions. For the Philippines, it was a war of survival, sacrifice, and betrayal, a fight that declared independence but left it unrealized. For America, it was the moment ideals of liberty clashed with the hunger for empire, leaving behind a silence that still echoes in classrooms today. To forget the war is to deny the lives lost and the lessons learned. The hidden battle that changed the U.S. empire was not fought in distant abstraction, but in real villages. with real families caught in its fire. As we close this story, let us remember the faces that history erased. The farmers turned fighters, the mothers who carried their children through burning fields, the soldiers who questioned their orders, and the voices silenced by empire. This was not just a hidden war, it was the making of an empire and the breaking of a dream. Thank you for joining us in uncovering the hidden Philippine battle that changed the U.S. empire. History is not only about victories remembered, but also about struggles erased, and today we've brought light to a story too often forgotten. If you believe these stories deserve to be heard, help us by liking this video, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel for more untold history. The past still speaks to us, through sacrifice, courage, and lessons we must never ignore. Together, let's ensure that these voices are never silenced again.